Well, this certainly costs some performance. Of course, we got ongoing function executions, we got a virtual comparison. It's needless to say that React is highly optimized for those executions and comparisons. So in a lot of apps, and especially in simple apps like this one, this will absolutely not matter. Nonetheless, in bigger apps you might want to optimize that, and therefore you as a developer can tell React that it should only re-execute this demo output component under certain circumstances. And those circumstances would be that the props which this component received changed, for example. So that if I bring back show false here, React actually checks if the show value changed, and only if that's the case, it will re-execute demo output. That might be closer to the behavior we want. How can we tell React that it should behave like this? Well, we have to go to the component for which we want to opt into that did the prop change check, and we simply wrap our component, for example here in the export line, with React memo. This is for functional components. For class-based components, this does not work, but I'll take a closer look at class-based components and how to optimize those in the class-based component section later down in the course. Since we can basically work with only functional components, class-based components are not the focus here. So React Memo allows us to optimize functional components. Now, what does Memo do? It tells React that for this component, which it gets as an argument, React should look at the props this component gets and check the new value for all those props and compare it to the previous value those props got. And only if the value of a prop changed, the component should be re-executed and re-evaluated. And if the parent component changed, but the prop values for that component here did not change, component execution will be skipped. If we wrap this and we save that, we can see the result of that by going back. Initially, of course, demo output is executed because the app was just rendered for the first time. But now if I clear the console, if I click this button, you see only app and button running is being printed. The demo output running is not being printed. And therefore, my paragraph running is also not being printed because my paragraph is a child of demo output. And if demo output is not re-executed, of course, its child is also not re-executed. So this is now an optimization in place here that avoids this unnecessary re-rendering. Now, that might bring up a new question though. Why aren't we using that on all components if it allows us to optimize them? Because this optimization comes at a cost. The memo method here tells React that whenever the app component changed, it should go to this component here and compare the new prop values to the previous prop values. So therefore, React needs to do two things. It needs to store the previous prop values and it needs to make that comparison. And that, of course, also has its own performance cost. And it therefore greatly depends on the component you're applying this to, whether it's worth it or not. Because you're trading the performance cost of re-evaluating the component for the performance cost of comparing props. And it's impossible to say which cost is higher because it depends on the number of props you have and on the complexity of your component and the number of child components your component has. Of course, React Memo can be a great tool if you have a huge component tree with a lot of child components, and on a high level in the component tree, you can avoid unnecessary re-render cycles for the entire branch of the component tree. Like in this case, by avoiding the re-evaluation of demo output, we're also automatically avoiding the re-evaluation of my paragraph, even though we're not using React Demo in there, just because we cut off this entire branch, so this entire branch of the component tree. That is something where React Memo can definitely be worth it. If you, on the other hand, have a component where you know it's going to change or its props values are going to change with pretty much every re-evaluation of the parent component anyways, then React Memo doesn't make a lot of sense. Because if the result is that the component should re-render anyways, well, then you can also save that extra comparison of the prop values. That's then just some overhead cost, which is not worth it. And of course, ultimately, as always, it depends on your app size. For small apps, for small component trees, and so on, for all of that, it might simply not worth it to add this. But for larger apps, where you can cut off entire branches of unnecessary re-evaluations, it might very well be worth it. You just don't want to wrap every component with React Memo. Instead, you want to pick some key parts in your component tree, which allows you to cut off an entire branch of child components. That's way more effective than doing this on every child component. So now that we learned about React Memo, let's also apply it to the button. We can argue whether that's good or not, because the button is a trivial component, so doing that prop checking might not be worth it. On the other hand, we as a developer know that this button realistically doesn't really change. So re-evaluating the button all the time shouldn't be worth it. There's nothing on it that changes, right? We have the same text, we have the same function, so why don't we wrap it? For that, let's go to button and use React Memo down here and wrap our button component with it. Now you will see something interesting if you do that. If you save that and reload the app, of course initially we see button running, but now if I click toggle paragraph, we again see button running. Why is that happening? That makes no sense, right? Well, we see button running again and again because actually its prop values did change. That's strange, right? If we have a look at that, it only gets one prop on click, or actually two props, the children here, but both prop values never change. We always have the same text and we always have the same function, right? Well, this is one of the most common gotchas with React. Keep in mind that this app component is just a function in the end. And it re-executes like a normal JavaScript function, because it is a normal JavaScript function, if your state changes. The only magic thing here is that the function is going to be called by React and not by you. But then it still executes like a normal function, which means all that code executes again. And that has one important implication. Of course, this function which you pass to the button is recreated. This is now a brand new function for every render or every execution cycle of the app function, because in the end it's just a normal constant which we recreate. All that code in here is executed again. So of course, a new function is created. This is not the same function all the time. It's a function that does the same thing, but technically to JavaScript, it's a brand new function for every time the app function is being executed. That's, by the way, also true for false being passed to demo output. Previously I said that this never changes. Even that technically was not correct. This app function is re-executed, therefore a new false value is created. So even if we had false in the last render cycle too, now we have a new false. But if that's the case, why does React Memo then work on the demo output but not on the button? What's the difference between false and the function here? If a new false is created and a new function is created, shouldn't then both components be re-evaluated? Well, for that you have to keep in mind that false is a boolean. And booleans like strings and numbers are primitive values in JavaScript. Now what React Memo does in the end is it has a look at all the prop values, and in the end it compares props show to props previous.show, you could say. This is not exactly what it does internally, but you can imagine it like that. So in the end, it has a look at the previous value for the show prop and compares it to the current value. And it does so with a regular comparison operator. Now for primitive values, that will work. Because for primitive values, if I compare two booleans, I get true if they are the same. If I compare two strings, I get true if they are the same. Now technically, that is a different boolean than this here, and that's a different string than this. These are two different values. But for primitive values, this comparison works. Now that's not true if you compare arrays or objects or functions. For comparing two arrays, let's say, which look similar to us humans, in JavaScript, they are not equal. And that's not React specific, that is JavaScript. And attached to this lecture, you find an article and a video on primitive and reference values so that you really understand this, because that's a core concept of JavaScript. Now, it's important to understand that functions are just objects in JavaScript. Again, not React specific, that's just JavaScript. So here a new function object is created with every time the app function runs. And this function object is passed to the onClick prop. Now therefore, button in the end compares props onClick to props previous.onClick, for example. And in there we have two function objects. Now two objects, even if they have the same content, are never equal in JavaScript when compared like this. And therefore, React Memo finds out that the value changed just because of how JavaScript works. Now that is really important to understand. I know it's a common gotcha and something a lot of developers, even more experienced ones, are struggling with. That's why I'm emphasizing it like this. This is crucial to understand and to get right. Now, of course, as a result of that, does this mean that React Memo is useless for components that receive objects or arrays or functions through their props? No, thankfully not. Let's have a look at the solution in the next lecture.